Welcome to the first session of the Jews for Judaism Survival Seminar. And what I'm hoping to do tonight is really cover with you, I think, the following basic questions. I think these are the important questions for tonight. Number one, who are the missionaries? You know, when Jews speak about Christian missionaries, it's important to understand who they are, because obviously in a world of over 2 billion Christians, not all Christians are invested in trying to convert us. So we want to try to understand a little bit of the geography of the world of Christendom tonight, to understand where the challenge, where the threat is emerging from. Secondly, we want to try to understand what motivates these people. Why are they so interested, even to the point of obsession, with converting Jews? What really makes them tick? That'll be the second question. The third question will be one of methodology. How do they go about doing it? What kind of technologies have they developed to reach out to the Jewish community? And finally, hopefully we'll have time to think about why are many Jews vulnerable to what they're doing? Okay, so hopefully that's what we'll try to accomplish tonight. So the first question, who are the missionaries? Again, I mentioned there are over 2 billion Christians in the world today. Some estimates are about 2.2 billion Christians. And we often don't appreciate as a Jewish community how diverse the Christian world is. You know, there are about 13 million Jews in the entire world. And so we have usually what are referred to as the 4 Jewish denominations, right? But some estimates are that there are over 30,000 Christian denominations. And that's a little bit overwhelming for us. You have many, many different groups that believe many different things, and obviously not all of them are equally committed to trying to share their faith with Jewish people. So rather than spend hours going through all of the details of this, which could be a very long study, I'll try to make it very simple. There are basically 4 groups that we're going to look at tonight. One group is what we'll refer to as the Roman Catholic Church, and I'm going to attach to them and lump in with them all of the Orthodox churches, the Greek Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox. So for our purposes, we're looking now at approximately 1 billion or so Christians, about 1 billion people in this first group. And what is important to understand, again, for our purposes tonight, these are groups that are not really, these days, involved in trying to convert Jews, for the most part. There happen to be several very small Catholic organizations that are directly interested in reaching Jews, but they're very, very small. By and large, the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Christian churches don't really have serious programs today to convert Jews. That was not always the case. Obviously, you know, for many, many hundreds of years, the Catholic Church was very much involved in missions to Jews, but that more or less has developed, it's withered out. It really doesn't exist anymore. So for our purposes tonight, we're going to basically, and for the next 6 weeks, for the rest of the course, we're not going to be thinking too much about the Roman Catholic Church, the Orthodox churches. They're not going to be on our radar screen. The more complicated part becomes the Protestant churches. Because again, the Roman Catholic Church has a pope. They have one leader. They're more or less monolithic. You don't have hundreds of dozens of Catholic denominations. They're basically one simple group. But when you get to the Protestant churches, here's where you have hundreds, if not thousands, of different denominations. Some estimates, for example, you've all heard of Baptists. Some estimates are that there are over 300 different kinds of Baptists. So we're talking about many, many different Protestant groups. And to make our life easier tonight, I'm going to basically divide them into 2. Basically divide all the Protestant churches into 2. What we'll refer to as the liberal churches and the conservative churches. The liberal churches are basically liberal when it comes to both theological issues and when it comes to social and political issues. Liberal Protestant churches in Canada, for example, the largest Protestant denomination in Canada is the United Church of Canada. What more or less typifies most of these groups is a liberal perspective when it comes to their Bible. Generally speaking, liberal Protestant groups take the position that their Bible is not the literal revealed Word of God. They don't see this as a book where every single word came directly from God. They tend to look at their Bible as a book that was written by inspired people. Maybe they were inspired by God, but they basically see it as a human document. They don't tend to take it very literally. And they often have fairly liberal positions when it comes to social and political issues. So, for example, when the Bible speaks against, let's say, homosexuality, that it's not considered to be acceptable behavior, so you'll find that when it comes to issues like same-sex marriage or gay rights, the liberal churches will tend to have more liberal positions because they don't find themselves locked into what the Bible actually says. Right? The Bible says it, but they'll say, fine, that was written 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. We have a different perspective nowadays. So we're not talking in our program for the next 6 weeks about these churches, because the liberal Protestant churches have absolutely no interest in trying to convert Jews. As a matter of fact, the United Church of Canada issued a formal statement not too many years ago, officially distancing themselves from efforts to try to convert Jews. And that goes more or less for most of the liberal Protestant churches. They're not involved in missions to Jews. However, the other side of the Protestant coin are what we call the conservative Protestants. And these are people that take their Bible very seriously because they believe that their Bible is the literal revealed Word of God. Conservative Protestants take a conservative view of revelation, of Scripture. They believe that every word in the Bible was given directly by God, and they take it very seriously. As one bumper sticker proclaimed, the Bible says it, and I believe it, and that settles it. Right? That's where they come from. And so therefore, they'll tend to take more or less more conservative positions on political and social issues, and they tend to take the more spiritual issues, again, more conservatively. So when the Christian Bible seems to direct people towards converting others, conservative Protestants take it very, very seriously. So the main focus of our study over the next 6 weeks will be these conservative Protestant denominations. And what you should be aware of is that in the Christian world, these are the churches that are growing. The more liberal Christian churches are almost emptying out. On Sundays, you don't find many people there. They're either flatlining, they're not growing, or they're diminishing rapidly, the more liberal churches. It's the more conservative churches that are growing and growing steadily. The fourth group we're going to look at tonight is sort of not as important, but they're important just to mention. It's a group that we'd refer to as modern Christian sects, S-E-C-T-S, sects. And this includes groups that more or less evolved over the past 150 years, groups like the Mormons, Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses. There are dozens of these modern Christian sects. And for our purposes, generally speaking, you should know that almost all of them do seek to convert Jews. The Mormons, the Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses are all actively engaged with programs to convert Jews. But obviously they're much, much smaller than the conservative Protestant churches. The estimates are that in North America, we're speaking of approximately, again, 70 or 80 million conservative Protestants. The estimates are that in Canada, about 10% of Canadians identify as evangelical Protestants, and in the United States, between 25 and 40% of Americans identify as evangelical conservative Protestants, what's referred to as the Christian right. So now that we have a sense of who the players are, let's try to understand why. Why are they so interested in converting us? The first reason is the most important one. I want you to pay attention to this one, because if you want to really get into the head of a conservative Christian, a Christian that we refer to as a missionary, the most critical reason to understand in terms of why they seek to convert other people is the following. If you wanted to identify probably the central verse in the Christian Bible, it's a verse that many Christians will scribble on phone booths. I don't know if they have phone booths anymore, but I remember when I lived in New York, you'd always find it written on a phone booth. But often at sporting events, Christians that are there will hold up a big sign. Often when there's a public event where a lot of the press shows up, I remember at the O.J. Simpson trial, whenever CNN camera crews came, there was always a couple of Christians with big signs held up that said John 3:16. And it's probably the most famous passage in the Christian Bible. I was just actually traveling, and I picked up a Gideon's Bible in my hotel room. And so in the beginning of the Bible, they had this passage in John chapter 3, verse 16, translated into dozens and dozens of languages. It says there in the Gospel of John chapter 3, verse 16, that God loved the world so much that he gave his only begotten Son, so that everyone who will believe in him will not perish, but have eternal life. That's basically what I would refer to as the aorta of the Christian Bible. It's the central passage in the Christian Bible, which basically says that God sent Jesus to the world. Christians believe that Jesus is the Messiah. They believe Jesus actually is God in the flesh, right? They believe he's the Son of God, not the Son of God being less than God, but Christians believe that Jesus is God the Son. And they see him as being sent by God to this world to die for the sins of the world. And then everyone who believes in him, as the Christian Bible says here, will not perish, which means they will not go and burn in hell forever, but they'll have eternal life. Now, if you understand the implications of this verse, and again, I mentioned that Christians who take this seriously take it very seriously. It's saying that if you believe in Jesus, you will go to heaven when you die, and you'll live in bliss in the world of heaven forever. If you don't come to faith in Jesus, you will burn in hell forever. And that's a very, very long time. Forever is not 100 years, not 1,000 years, it's infinite. So Christians who take this seriously feel what they describe as a burden on their hearts. They have a burden on their hearts for a world they see that is perishing. They basically see a world where many, many, many people they know, friends of theirs, relatives, people they might work with, it could be a stranger they meet, flying on a plane somewhere, it could be a coworker, but the people in their lives that they know that don't believe in Jesus, they believe are going to burn in hell forever. And if you want to understand what motivates them to try to share their faith, what motivates them to speak about Jesus, it's this concern for people in the world that they see as perishing. You can imagine someone discovered the cure for cancer. Right? Imagine someone somehow came up with a cure for cancer. They wouldn't keep it to themselves. They wouldn't keep it as a family heirloom. If they really discovered such a thing, right, they would feel an obligation, a moral obligation to get this cure into the hands of every doctor, every hospital, every researcher, every cancer patient. You'd be a very sick, miserable, cruel, mean person if you had the cure for cancer and you kept it to yourself. So Christians are dealing with something which is much more serious than cancer. Cancer will take away 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years out of your life. But they're talking here about eternity, forever and ever and ever. So they feel a tremendous obligation to share their faith with people who don't believe. They believe that they have an obligation to do this. And their Bible gives them that obligation. The question that this leaves us with, though, is a serious question. Because in a world where Christians would see all Jews and all Buddhists and all Hindus and all Muslims and all Jains and all Baha'is and all Sikhs, right? And all atheists and many, many other people as not having faith in Jesus, so you would imagine they would have tremendous missions to all of these groups. The question that we're left with now is that if all of the world, all these people are going to hell if they don't believe in Jesus, why are Jews singled out as such a special target? I'll give you an example. Most of you, I'm sure, have heard of a group called Jews for Jesus. I'm sure that everyone in the room has heard of this organization. They specialize in targeting the Jewish community to convert us to Christianity. Most people are not aware of the fact that that's just one organization. And there are over 1,000 similar organizations. Over 1,000 similar groups to Jews for Jesus that are organized for the purpose of targeting and reaching out to the Jewish people. Now, you would expect, if there's such a huge effort to reach 13 million Jews, so how many Christian missionary organizations should be in the world today targeting the 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, or the 900 or so million Hindus? Right? Mathematically, if it was going to be a proportional amount of effort, there would be thousands and thousands and thousands of groups to try to reach Muslims. Many, many, many thousands of groups to reach Hindus and Buddhists, and yet they don't exist. The only group that has such a massive effort directed at it are the Jewish people. Why is that? Why are we such a special target for the Christian world? And that's the next question I would like to explore. Every year for the past, a dozen or so years, there's been a conference I've attended here in Toronto called Mission Fest. Mission Fest is a huge conference of many, many missionary organizations. They used to have it all the time downtown at the Toronto Convention Center. They move it around now, but they have hundreds and hundreds of missionary groups that set up booths and displays at Mission Fest. And every year I go to see how many groups are there targeting the Jewish community here in Toronto. And every year there are 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's just in that convention. There are probably at least 40 of these organizations in the GTA. But here at this conference, there are usually 7 to 12, 13 different groups represented with booths and displays that are trying to convert Jews. And I look around and I try to see how many groups are there at this conference trying to reach Muslims, or Sikhs, or Hindus, or Buddhists. Usually none. Usually there are generic missionary organizations like, let's say, the Billy Graham Crusade, who tries to reach everyone. So there are many groups like that. But you don't see many, many groups at this conference that are specializing in reaching, let's say, the Buddhist community in Toronto. And that's typical of what goes on in the world. There is a massive effort to reach Jews, far out of proportion to the effort spent reaching other religious and ethnic groups. So let's try to explore why that is. I'm going to share with you 3 reasons. Try to pay attention, try to keep them in mind. 3 reasons, and these may not exhaust all of the reasons. These are the 3 that I'll be sharing tonight. Number 1, the first reason I would share with you is that the Bible points Christians to Jews. And the Bible doesn't point them to anyone else. For example, when a Christian reads their Bible, this is a Christian Bible, but the first 4/5 of the Christian Bible is the Jewish Bible, right? The first 4/5 is the Jewish Bible. So when a Christian reads their Bible, they're reading about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and Aaron and King David and King Solomon. They're reading about the temple in Jerusalem, and they're reading about the Jewish holidays, and it's very Jewish. Right? And this book, the Jewish Bible, speaks about the Jewish people as a very special people. We're God's chosen people. We're the apple of God's eye. The Bible says, I'll bless those who bless the Jews. I'll curse those who curse the Jews. So when a Christian picks up their Bible, they don't read one word in here about Sikhs or Muslims or Buddhists or Baha'is or Jains. Nothing. But there's a lot of stuff in here about Jews. And then they get to what is referred to as the Greek Testament or the New Testament. Very interesting. Here's a book that's focused on a person named Jesus, who was a Jew living in Israel, and his 12 students were Jews, and they're going to the temple in Jerusalem, and they're celebrating the Jewish Shabbat. It's very Jewish. And it's interesting that Jesus says to his disciples, he says to them, I want you to go out and share my message. The very first words that Jesus says to his students are, follow me, I'll make you the fishers of men. You're going to go fishing for men, right? You're going to go and catch people, bring them into our movement. But he says to his students, go not unto the cities of the Samaritans, go not unto the cities of the Gentiles. He says to them, I'm only sending you to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So here you get this book, which is not the Jewish Bible, now it's the Christian Bible, and yet it still seems to be very Jewish. A Jewish man living in Israel, Jewish students going to the temple, and he says to them, don't go to non-Jews. Don't try to teach non-Jews. Only go to the Jewish people. At the end of Jesus' life, the very end of the 4 Gospels, they speak about something that's called the New Commission, the Great Commission. And the Great Commission says, now go to the whole world. So the Gospels, the four Gospels, which the Christian Bible begins with, ends with a directive to now go beyond the Jewish people and try to go to the entire world. Nevertheless, Paul, who writes most of the books in the Christian Bible, Paul says in the book of Romans chapter 1 verse 16 that the good news about Jesus has to go to the Jews first and then to the non-Jews. So if you want to try to understand why is there priority among Christians to reach Jews, it's because the Bible points them to us, right? Their own Bible says to the Jew first. And if you read the stationery of many of these Christian groups that target Jews, that's what the headline says. That's what their top of the stationery says. Why are we doing this? To the Jew first. Second reason. Some of you might remember, not too long ago, 12 years ago, right? We were in the year 2000, right? If you remember the year 2000, there were a lot of strange things going on. There was a tremendous fear that all the computers would crash, right? Y2K, and people were even buying bottled water and getting generators from their homes. I mean, the world was getting very nervous around the turn of the millennium. And many, many Christians expected that their Messiah, Jesus, would return in the year 2000. It's one of the major teachings in Christianity is the idea of the second coming of Jesus, that he's going to have to return. And when is he supposed to come back? So it's interesting that many, many Christians, I would say the vast majority, believe that the return of Jesus is imminent, just around the corner. And I often go to Christian bookstores and I read many Christian books and magazines, and this is a very hot topic of conversation. They believe the end times are upon us. They believe that Jesus is coming back very, very soon. And many of them thought that the year would be the year 2000, but if it didn't work out to the year 2000, they believe that the signs are pointing to the times we're living in now. They see that many of the signs that were given for the second coming of Jesus have already been fulfilled. The Jews have come back to their homeland. They've recaptured Jerusalem and the Western Wall. And there are many things that they believe confirm that they have every right to expect Jesus to come back soon. There may be one problem, however. There may be one problem. And I want to make it clear that what I'm going to share with you now is not held by all Christians, but by some Christians. The Christian Bible says in the book of Matthew, chapter 23, verse 39, it quotes Jesus saying, "You will never see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.' Baruch haba b'shem Hashem." Who was he speaking to? We know before who he was speaking to. He only spoke to Jews. So he's speaking to the Jewish people and saying to them, "You will never see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" Now, I'm not quite sure what that means, but what many Christian commentaries explain that to mean is that Jesus will not come back until the Jewish people accept him. There is a feeling among many Christians, not all, but among many Christians, that in order for Jesus to return, the Jewish people must first come to believe in him. And therefore, many Christians believe that by converting Jews, they will be able to hasten the coming of Jesus. They don't believe this is true about any other people in the world. No Christian believes that in order for Jesus to come back, the Buddhists or the Hindus or the Muslims or the Sikhs have to convert. But many of them do believe that the Jews have to convert because of what it says in their Bible. And so if you want a second possible motivation for why there's such a serious effort placed on Jews more than any other religious ethnic group in the world, it's because some Christians believe that we are holding up the show. We are the ones that are getting in the way of progress. And they need to convert us in order to facilitate the return of Jesus. That's a second reason. A third reason, and this one's going to be a little bit more complicated, so as we say in Yiddish, halt cup. You've got to sort of follow along now. In 1986, I attended a conference in Tonawanda, New York, not far from here, right outside of Buffalo, of a Christian denomination called the Assemblies of God. The Assemblies of God is a Pentecostal Christian denomination. These are the Christians that speak in tongues, a lot of faith healings, a lot of prophecy going on, a lot of people with their hands up in the air. And they had a conference going on for many, many years called the Ruach Conference. Ruach is the Hebrew word for spirit. And it was a 3-day conference where they learned how to convert Jews to Christianity. And I attended the conference with a friend of mine. This is back in 1986. And I remember there must have been 300 or 400 people at the conference. Everyone was very, very sweet to us. Oh, we love Israel, and Jesus loves you, and God loves the Jewish people, and I love you, and everyone loved us. It was very lovey-dovey, very sweet. Except one person came up to me and said, Rabbi Skobac, you Jewish people are very stupid. I was a bit taken aback, because it's not usual sales technique, to insult the people you're trying to influence. So I said, we're very stupid. What makes you say that? Why do you say that? He says, you're stupid because you listen to the teachings of the rabbis. You listen to what the rabbis teach. I said, okay, what's your point? He says, well, who is the greatest rabbi that ever lived? So I said, I don't know, you tell me. So he said, well, wasn't it Rabbi Akiva? Wasn't Rabbi Akiva the greatest rabbi that ever lived? So I said, well, he's probably in the top 10. Probably easily in the top 10. So I don't know who the best one is, the greatest one, but Rabbi Akiva will be up there. So he says to me, well, Rabbi Skobac, don't you remember that Rabbi Akiva thought that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah? Now, Bar Kokhba was a Jewish general, great Jewish general, who lived about 100 years after Jesus, and he led a revolution, a revolt against the Romans. He was quite successful. And Rabbi Akiva said he's going to be the Messiah. So this missionary says to me, well, Rabbi Skobac, Rabbi Akiva was obviously wrong. And if your greatest rabbi was wrong about the Messiah, he said maybe all the other rabbis are wrong for rejecting Jesus. And if all the rabbis are wrong for rejecting Jesus, you Jews are very stupid for listening to the rabbis. Anyway, he was feeling very good about himself. He thought he scored some big points. So I asked him a very simple question. And this was not my question. This story that I told you actually happened to a famous rabbi many, many years ago, Rav Chaim of Brisk. He was on a train, he heard some missionaries, so I had to basically just steal his lines. Very easy for me. So I asked this missionary, I said, let me ask you a question. You're putting down all the Jews now because you assume that Rabbi Akiva was wrong. I asked him, why do you think Rabbi Akiva was wrong? What makes you so sure that Rabbi Akiva was wrong? I asked him, how do you know Bar Kokhba wasn't the Messiah? I asked this to the missionary. He looks at me like I'm crazy. Bar Kokhba, the Messiah? He said he was obviously not the Messiah because he was killed by the Romans and he didn't bring peace to the world. Okay, now some of you are laughing, but he didn't get it. He didn't really understand this. It took him about a minute to realize, wait a second. That's how we know that Bar Kokhba wasn't the Messiah, because he was killed by the Romans and didn't bring peace to the world? Where does that leave Jesus? So, that's basically what happened 2,000 years ago. Right? 2,000 years ago, it became very clear to the Jewish people. I believe personally that Jesus himself understood he wasn't the Messiah, because his final words on the cross were not mission accomplished. His final words on the cross were, my God, why have you forsaken me? But when he died without accomplishing anything the Messiah was supposed to accomplish, the Jewish people understood, okay, I guess it's not him. So what happens? It's interesting that Paul, who again I mentioned before, Paul was the main teacher of Christianity. He wrote most of the New Testament documents. Paul says in the book of Acts, which is the book that follows the four Gospels, after Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, comes the book of Acts, which is the history of the Christian movement after the death of Jesus. And Paul says there that since the Jewish people are not really accepting Jesus, Paul says, I am going to go to the Gentiles. So Paul makes himself basically the apostle to the Gentiles. He goes out all over the ancient world, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, and he teaches his understanding of who Jesus was, and he makes many converts. Christianity basically became a product of this movement of Paul. The Jews that had followed Jesus for the 3 years that he was teaching, that group basically disappeared. Within a few short 150 years, 200 years, there really were no more of these Jewish people who thought Jesus might have been the Messiah. That group of his disciples died out. But what became the Christian church in history were basically these non-Jews that Paul was successful in converting. And this church grew and grew and grew into what we now know is the largest religion in the world. As this group was growing, as this church was growing, one question began to really bother them. Really started to bother them, which is, if Jesus really was the Messiah, who should have been the first people to believe in him? If he really was, again, these are non-Jews that are asking the question. These are the non-Jewish converts of Paul. And they begin asking themselves, if he really was the Jewish Messiah, who should have been the first people to believe in him? They understood that the first people should have been the Jews. Right? These were the people that were hoping the Messiah would come. These are the people that even knew what the whole concept of Messiah was. The non-Jewish world didn't even believe in God. They were basically pagans. Until Paul came to reach out to them, they were worshiping sticks and bugs and trees and animals and stars. They didn't have a Bible. They didn't even know the meaning of the word Messiah. And now they come to believe Jesus was the Messiah, and they start asking themselves, wait a second, okay, we believe that Jesus is the Messiah, but why don't the Jews believe it? And this question really began to bother them. So the Christian Bible suggests an answer, actually two answers, but one major answer. The Christian Bible says, do you know what happened 2,000 years ago? That really, all things being equal, the Jews obviously should have understood that Jesus was the Messiah. So what went wrong? So the Christian Bible says, you know what went wrong? The devil, Satan, blinded the eyes of the Jewish people and prevented them from seeing the truth. And Christians believe that to this day, Jewish people have scales that cover our eyes and blind us spiritually. Many, many, many Christian preachers speak about the spiritual blindness of the Jewish people. I've had many Christians pray over me. They raise their hands and they say, Lord, please remove those scales from Michael's eyes so he'll be able to see the truth. That's what they believe. Because they can't understand, if we didn't have these scales covering our eyes, why can't we see the truth, which to them is so clear and plain. So the first thing that the Christian Bible suggests is that the Jews were blinded by the devil. There's a second thing that's raised in the Christian Bible. It's not developed as clearly, but it became a very common teaching in the Middle Ages. If any of you are familiar with medieval Christian art, right, you'll understand where this is coming from. In the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 44, Jesus says to the Jewish people, you are of your father, the devil. He speaks about the Jewish people being the children of the devil. Now, this does not mean that they were blinded by the devil. This is a little bit worse. And in the Middle Ages, this became a very common teaching. That you know why the Jewish people didn't accept Jesus? Not because Nebuch, they were blinded by Satan. It's because the Jews are Satan. And that's why, again, in Christian medieval art, we're depicted with tails and horns, right? And we look like the devil. Because in their mind, this is a very, very insidious idea. What they're saying is that, you know what? The Jewish people at the time of Jesus, they knew he was the Messiah. The Jews knew he was the Messiah. But because they're so wicked and evil, they refused to believe that which they knew. Meaning the Jews knew the truth, but they denied it. Now, who could be so wicked and evil to know the truth and to deny it, but who? But the devil himself. No one could be that evil and that wicked to know the truth and to deny it. So these are two theories. The first theory, which is a little bit more conciliatory, all right, the Jews are victimized by the devil, they were blinded by Satan, it's not their fault. The second theory makes us a lot worse, right? We are the devil. Now, those are two theories. Going back to the times of the Christian Bible, let me ask you this. If you were a thinking Christian living today, and you were wondering about your Jewish friends, your Jewish doctor, right, your Jewish neighbors, why don't they believe in Jesus? A, maybe they're blinded by the devil. B, maybe they are the devil. Now, do you think there's a third possible answer that might present itself? Meaning, could there be another reason why Jews don't believe in Jesus? Other than the fact that they're blinded by Satan or they are Satan? Well, I think there is a third possibility that might present itself, which is that maybe the Jews are right. I mean, maybe 2,000 years ago, the Jews were right in not believing in Jesus. Maybe Jesus wasn't the Messiah, and that's why the Jews didn't accept him. Now, on some level, this is a very reasonable idea, because who should have been right 2,000 years ago? Gentile pagans who were worshiping bugs and didn't even know what the meaning of the word Messiah was? Or Jews who had a Bible for many, many, many hundreds and hundreds of years, knew what the Messiah was, were praying for the Messiah to come, and they knew that Jesus wasn't the Messiah. That's a possibility. Probably a very good possibility. But I'll tell you that it's such a terrifying possibility that virtually no Christian will be able to articulate it. What happens is it sits there in their kishkas. It sits there in their guts and it annoys them. It irritates them. It bothers them. But because it's such a frightening possibility, it rarely makes its way up to be able to be thought about or articulated. But I believe it's cooking there. And I believe that one of the things that motivates Christians to want to convert Jews is that we trouble them psychologically. That their passion and their zeal to convince us is really an effort to convince themselves. Now, this is not my theory. Eric Hoffer, who's a very famous philosopher, wrote a book called The True Believer. And in his book, The True Believer, he tries to understand the psychology of someone who is obsessed with converting other people to their beliefs. And Eric Hoffer suggests that the person who's obsessed with converting other people often harbors internal doubts. That deep down inside, they're conflicted. They have doubts about their own beliefs. And in order to assuage those doubts, in order to make those doubts go away, they seek to convert specifically the cause of those doubts. And you have to understand, when a Christian today goes to India and tries to convert Hindu sadhus in India, right? They don't look at these Hindus in India and say, oh, maybe they're right, maybe we're wrong, right? They look at the rest of the world as being unenlightened, But they look at the Jew and they see Jews. We are the people of the book. We're the people of the Bible. We know our stuff. We were the experts 2,000 years ago on the whole topic of the Messiah. We were the experts. They can't look at us as being unenlightened. And so we present a psychological challenge. We make them very, very nervous. Because deep down inside, they're afraid maybe the Jews are right. So Hoffer suggests that in order to, how do you deal with that? Either you convert to Judaism, or you've got to convert the Jews. Now, this is a theory that I always thought was true, and it was confirmed for me when I read the statement of a Christian minister who I think in a moment of incredible honesty said the following. This is James Christison, who was the General Secretary of the American Baptist Church's National Mission Society. He would call in Judaism a macher. And he had an interview with Rabbi James Rudin from Present Tense magazine, and he said the following. He said, after all, unconverted Jews make Christians wonder if perhaps Jesus is not the Messiah after all. So, I think that the way Shakespeare might have phrased it, methinks the missionary dost protest too much. And I think that one way of understanding their incredible obsession with converting Jews is that it's really an effort to convince themselves that what they believe is true by dealing with this group of people that causes them on some, I believe, deep level to question their own beliefs. What happened, we all know, over the last 2,000 years was that Christianity became very successful in spreading their faith to the entire world. Right? If you think about it, Christianity began with 12 Jewish guys. Think about it. It's a religion that began with 12 Jewish guys, and they managed to convert basically all of North America, all of South America, because those are the default religions in North and South America. You go to Europe, at least until recently, the default religion was Christianity. We'll see what happens there over the next 25 to 50 years. But they managed to convert all of Europe. And the fastest growing religions in Africa today and in China are Christianity. I mean, if you want to see the spread of Christianity in Korea, it's quite amazing. In Australia, right? These are places where Christianity is growing and growing and growing. There are massive Christian efforts to share their faith with the entire world. And today, with the aid of television and the internet, they're able to reach out to the entire world. And they've been successful, more or less, in making their religion the most popular religion in the world. Again, over 2.2 billion Christians. But there's one group in the world that seems to have always been immune. That somehow they've never really been successful in converting the Jewish people. And over the past 50, 60, 70 years, they've begun to question this. They have begun asking themselves, why? Why have we been so unsuccessful in reaching the Jews? And especially now, when many of them think that it's so critical to convert the Jews to allow Jesus to return, and they more or less converted almost the rest of the world anyway, they began taking this question seriously. And they've done incredible research, studies, conferences all over the world. There's a conference called the Lausanne Conference, which is met in all parts of the world. In Switzerland, in Thailand they met. They went here in Toronto a few years ago. Major conferences to deal with the question of the Jewish people. And they asked themselves, why have we been so unsuccessful in reaching the Jewish people? And they basically have come to understand there are two answers to this problem. More or less, two answers. Problem number one is the realization that they have a tremendous image problem to deal with. They have a tremendous public relations problem to deal with because they try to understand what the Jews associate Christianity with. For the past 2,000 years, Jews have associated Christianity with persecution, with hatred, with pogroms, with crusades, with the Inquisition, with the Holocaust, with being beaten up as children. You dirty Jew, you killed our God. For 2,000 years, that's been the Jewish experience. So when the Christians have had these conferences and they ask themselves, so why aren't the Jews flocking into our churches? This answer presents itself. They say, well, because the Jews think we hate them. I remember years ago when I gave a lecture at one of the Christian seminaries here in Toronto. Right before I spoke to the students, the professor, the minister, said to me, you know, Rabbi, it must be very difficult for you to be a Jew today in a Christian world. And I don't know what he meant by that. What do you mean by that? He said, well, because of all the hatred directed at your people from the church over the past 2,000 years, it must be very difficult for you to really seriously consider Christianity as an option, as a real option. So I said, I'll tell you the truth. I said that, honestly speaking, for me, it's not really relevant. I said, the fact that you people have been horrible salespeople for the last 2,000 years doesn't really affect the real issue here. The real issue is not whether you've been nice to us, because even if you were nice to us for 2,000 years, that wouldn't change the real issue. The real issue is we don't reject Christianity because of persecution. We reject it because it's not true. That's the real, I'm honest with them. That's the problem. For example, Mormons. The nicest people in the world are Mormons. Never hurt one Jew, always smiling, always pleasant. Jews are not embracing Mormonism because they're nice. Being nice is irrelevant. It's a question of what's true. And I said, the real issue is that for us, Jesus is not the Messiah. He's not God. Christianity is not true. That's why we reject it. It's not because you guys have persecuted us. That made it much easier for us to reject it. But that wasn't the real issue. And so we should know, though, that many Christians believe this is the real issue. And I'll tell you the truth, unfortunately, for many Jews it is. Because for many Jews, they really can't express why Christianity isn't true. You know, we'll discuss this in the coming weeks. But many Jewish people might say, well, we're Jewish, we don't believe in Jesus. Why not? Because we're Jewish. But why don't Jews believe in Jesus? Because we don't. Why don't you? Because we're Jewish. Right? You can see how compelling this kind of thinking is. There's not much substance to the rejection that many Jewish people have. Right? It's just sort of a knee-jerk response that I'm a Jew, we don't believe in Jesus. Do you understand why? No. So for many Jews, anti-Semitism has been sort of an easy way of not having to deal with Christianity. Right? If they hate us, we don't really care what they believe. But many Christians believe this is a very critical piece of the puzzle. And that's why you have to understand that over the past 50 and 60 years, there have been many, many Christian organizations that have basically taken the approach that the best way to convert Jews will be to be nice to the Jews. Many Christian groups today, especially what we call Christian Zionist groups, say that by supporting the Jewish people and supporting Israel and showing unconditional love to the Jewish people, right, we will be able to convert the Jews. Let me share with you one article from a missionary who I've written about in the past, where he basically spells this out. Frank Eichler, who runs a group called Shalom International, wrote to his supporters the following. It's a name that caused Jews to blink and shrink back in fear. It's a name that was used most frequently by those punching Jewish faces, destroying Jewish property, even killing Jewish people. The name was not Adolf Hitler. The name was Jesus Christ. Those hating in his name, meaning those Christians that hated the Jewish people in the name of Jesus, they didn't really know Jesus. They were not real Christians. But the Jews didn't know that. The Jews didn't know that these persecutors were not real Christians. They just knew that Jesus and pain went together. But not anymore, Frank Eichler says, because every time that we absorb some of the hate aimed at the Jewish people, every time that we rush to their side when they are lied about, every time that we are the first Gentiles to identify with their fears and pain and loneliness, they will see another Jesus, the real one. I want to see Christians all across America wake up and stand up for the Jewish people. Only then will Jews be impressed and one day want Jesus as their Messiah. So one of the things that's happening in the world today is that there are many, many Christian missionary groups that don't read the Bible with us, don't talk about believing in Jesus. They just feel that by eliminating the barrier to Jewish conversion, and they believe that the barrier is this negative image that Jews have of Christianity and of Christians, all they need to do is get rid of that barrier and Jews will convert. Again, I want to stress that this is a red herring. It's not the real reason Jews don't convert. 2,000 years ago, the Jews did not reject Jesus because he was conducting anti-Semitic pogroms in Palestine. That's not why they rejected him. They didn't believe in him, again, because he wasn't the Messiah. But again, for so many Jewish people, we have such negative associations with Christianity, that has become, for many Jewish people, probably the main reason why they don't take Christianity as a possible option. But these missionary conferences discovered a second reason, a second problem that they have to deal with. And that is that, you know why the Jewish people don't convert to Christianity? Because they think that Christianity isn't Jewish. Now here they're onto something. When they say to themselves that the Jews don't want to convert because they think that Christianity isn't Jewish, that's right. That's exactly why we don't want to convert. It's a big problem for them to deal with. And one of the things that they figured out is that for the past 2,000 years, they've presented their whole program to us in the wrong way. Because for 2,000 years, what the Christians basically have said to the Jewish people is, look, I'm a Christian, you're a Jew, please consider converting to Christianity. Now, in the ears of a Jew, what does that sound like? I'm going to convert from Judaism to Christianity. So if you do that, what happens to your Judaism? You're throwing it down in the garbage. You're trashing your Judaism. You're trashing your Jewish identity. And Christians have gotten the message that for Jewish people, we have this feeling that, look, I was born a Jew, I'm going to die a Jew. I'm not converting to something else. And they've come to realize that even the most non-religious Jews, even Jews that have never been to a synagogue, feel that way. They have a strong Jewish identity. We live in a world today where people take personal identity seriously. I had a secretary when I first came to Toronto who was adopted, and she spent so many hours trying to find her birth parents. People want to know, who am I? What's my identity? We live in a country. How many years ago was there a referendum to possibly split Canada into two countries? Over what issue? Were there people from Quebec being killed? Right? Was there murders going on? But it was a question of identity, of language, of who are we as a people. Why was there a war in Kosovo and Herzegovina, in the former Yugoslavia? That was over ethnic identity. So we live in a world where people appreciate today how important identity is. And what Christians finally understood was, you know what? Jewish people take their Jewish identity very seriously. It means a lot to them to feel that they're a Jew and they're not going to give it up. So we've got a big problem. Because if the Jews think that Christianity isn't Jewish, how will they ever convert? So incredibly, for the last 50, 60, 70 years, the approach of many missionary organizations has been to do an end run around this problem and say, no, Christianity is Jewish. And in the words of the Jews for Jesus organization, when you convert to Christianity, it's the most Jewish thing that you can do. There's nothing more Jewish that you can do than to believe in Jesus. Here they're tackling this problem head on. They're trying to say, don't think that when you accept Jesus, you're going to be less of a Jew. They say, on the contrary, you're going to become a better Jew. You'll become a more fulfilled Jew. You can have everything that you had previously, but now you're going to have, in addition, the Jewish Messiah. Now, the big problem that they've had is, how do you convince Jewish people that it's Jewish to believe in Jesus? It's a tough sales job. It's a hard thing to do. So what they've come to understand is that, and this is true of so much in marketing, what do all the marketers always say? Sell the sizzle, not the steak, right? I mean, most people don't deal with the nitty-gritty. Most people deal on the surface, right? I just heard today on the radio as I was driving here, Justin Bieber came out with a new perfume. And it's breaking all the records for. Now you think it's really the best perfume in the world, or you think maybe it's doing well because of the name on it, right? So that's the world we live in. We live in a world where people are pretty simple. They don't dig very deeply into things. And what they need to do is come up with a way of just making Jewish people feel more comfortable with Christianity, right? How do you do that if you're a Christian missionary? So the basic approach has been to come up with a venue, to invent a venue where Christianity can be presented in a way where it feels and looks and tastes and smells more Jewish. Because again, what the Christians have realized is that for many Jewish people, we would choke on this Christianity. It was a pill that just wouldn't go down. It's just not working. How do we make it more palatable? How do we make our product something that goes down easier? How do we overcome the tremendous resistance that Jewish people have in terms of guilt? Jewish people feel tremendous guilt when they convert to another religion, right? It was a tremendous embarrassment for so many generations. How do you get over the guilt? And how do you get over the allergy that Jewish people have to losing their identity? So, over the past decades, what has evolved is a movement, what they refer to, initially it was referred to as Hebrew Christianity, and now over the past 30 or so years, more referred to usually as Messianic Judaism. And it's an effort to, again, present Christianity in a way that is, I'll say euphemistically called culturally sensitive. In many Christian seminaries, they speak about this as cross-cultural communication. Right? I think it's a euphemism for, being deceptive. But again, there's an effort to give the impression that somehow what we're exposing you to is really Jewish. So for example, they understand that for many Jewish people, we're not comfortable going into a church that meets on a Sunday, that has big stained glass window pictures of you-know-who, and that has crosses all over the place, and a priest with a collar, and there are songs about the blood of the Lord. For many Jewish people, it's creepy. We're not comfortable going into a Christian setting. It's not familiar to us. It's very, very unfamiliar. It's uncomfortable. So now we have a place where you can invite your Jewish friends and neighbors to, and it's not called a church anymore. It's just, the name is changed to protect the guilty. We now call it a synagogue. It's a Messianic synagogue. Often meets on a Saturday, Shabbat. And these Messianic synagogues don't have the stained glass window pictures of Jesus. They don't have big crosses. You'll find these congregations that meet on Saturday have a lot of Israeli flags, Jewish stars. Many will have a holy ark in the front that has a Torah scroll. The names of these congregations, again, is not the First Baptist Messianic Synagogue. They'll have names like Petach Tikva, Beth Shalom. In Dallas, Texas, they have a congregation called Congregation Baruch Hashem. It sounds very Jewish. And so the architecture tries to look very Jewish and avoid Christian symbols. The names are very Jewish. Again, doesn't meet on Sunday usually, doesn't meet on Christmas, doesn't have Easter services, but there are Shabbat services, and Yom Kippur, and Rosh Hashanah, and Sukkot, and Hanukkah, and Purim, and Yom HaAtzmaut, and all the Jewish holidays. The person that leads the service is not called a minister or a priest, but is called a Messianic rabbi, and doesn't have a collar, but wears a yarmulke, wears a talit. Many of the people in the congregation wear a yarmulke, kippah, wear a talit. It looks quite Jewish. Jewish people that come are taught the true meaning of the Jewish holidays that they've never been exposed to. So for example, in these congregations, they explain that, you know why in the Jewish Passover Seder there were 3 matzahs at the Passover Seder? Because those 3 matzahs represent the Av, the Ben, and the Ruach HaKodesh, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, the Christian Trinity. That's why there are 3 matzahs. And you know why the middle matzah is broken? The afikomen? Because that's the son who was killed. And that's why that matzah has stripes in it, has holes in it, has piercings in it, because Jesus was pierced. And you know why the matzah is wrapped up in a white cloth, a white napkin? Because he was buried in a white shroud. And you know why that middle matzah is put away until the end of the Seder and brought back? That's the second coming of the Messiah. Every single element, every element of Judaism is reinterpreted and is given a Christian spin, right? But the body, right, what we call the guts of what it looks like, has a Jewish appearance. It's just given a Christian interpretation. These congregations and this movement is extremely sensitive to language. You know, people who are into communication, people into sales understand that the language we use is very critical. It helps to reframe everything. So you will not hear, generally speaking, Jesus referred to in these places as Jesus or Jesus Christ. Because again, to Jewish people, hearing Jesus Christ is like having someone scratching their fingernails on a blackboard. We're not comfortable with that. So they call Jesus by what they think might have been his Hebrew name, Yeshua. And instead of saying Christ, they say the Messiah, HaMashiach. Yeshua HaMashiach, right? Which is Hebrew for Jesus, the Messiah. And his mother Mary becomes a nice Jewish woman named Miriam. The Apostle Paul, to me, in my ears, nothing sounds more non-Jewish than the Apostle Paul. He's called Rav Shaul, Rabbi Shaul. That sounds much better. And the New Testament, they don't call it the New Testament because, again, for Jewish people, that's pretty creepy. I have in my library a Christian Bible that has on the side a Jewish star, and on the front a menorah, but they'll just refer to the Christian Bible as the Brit HaChadashah, Hebrew for New Testament. But again, If you say Brit HaChadashah, it sounds much more Jewish than saying New Testament. Baptism. Jewish people are not anxious to get baptized. So it's called the mikvah service, the mikvah, right? Which is basically what Jews did before there was a Christianity. We also immersed ourselves in water. The Christian baptism is basically an adaptation of the Jewish mikvah. But basically, all the terminology that might be annoying to Jewish ears, it might be abrasive to Jewish ears because it has an association with Christianity, they have euphemistic equivalents that just sound more Jewish, less abrasive. And people begin to get the impression that, hey, this is very Jewish. I feel very comfortable here. There's nothing here that turns me off. You should realize and understand that this movement has become successful. And for the first time in 2,000 years, they've come up with a formula, an approach to converting Jews that has started to work. Now, there are many reasons why it started to work. It's not simply because their sales approach is so much better. It comes with a second problem that we'll get to in a few minutes. But let me, before we get to the conclusion for tonight, share with you just a few more things that is important to understand. This approach to converting Jews has become quite successful and quite extensive now over the past 50 or 60 years. Just as an example, in the early 1970s, there may have only been a dozen or so of these Messianic synagogues in North America. Not many more than a dozen or so. Today there are probably close to 500. So that's quite dramatic in terms of growth. That you have now many, many, many congregations throughout North America, not just in the big cities, but almost wherever you go. You go to any phone book and you can look up synagogues and you'll find Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, and you'll find Messianic. They now have a second generation of kids being raised in this movement. So now you have the beginnings of a day school or Hebrew school movement to provide education for their children. So for example, right here in Toronto, there's the Melech Yisrael Academy for children. In Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, they have the Chalutzim Day School for their students. In Baltimore, Maryland, the Eitz Chaim Day School for their students. And this is becoming popular all across North America because where are they going to send their kids? They don't want to go to a secular public school. They're not going to be welcome in a Jewish yeshiva. So they have their own day schools and yeshivot now. And they're now developing, quote-unquote, rabbinical schools, probably about 9 or 10 or more that are training rabbis for these congregations and teachers for these day schools. And the movement has done so well here in North America, it's being exported very actively and aggressively throughout the rest of the world. So if you go to the Jewish major population centers in South America, in Chile, in Argentina, in Brazil, you'll see these congregations that are growing there. You go to the major Jewish population centers in Europe, in France, and in England, these congregations are growing there. In Israel, there are now approximately 130 of these congregations. In the former Soviet Union, I first went there in the year 1990, and there were no Messianic Jewish congregations, zero. The last report that I read showed that in the Ukraine alone, there were over 100 of these congregations. In Kiev, the largest city, over 1,000 people coming every Friday night to their services. Over 100 in Russia, right? And even in places like Australia, you have this movement growing and growing rapidly. How do they work today? Let me just share with you two things to bear in mind. Most people still unfortunately assume that what missionaries do to convert Jews is to go out on street corners, hand out literature, knock on people's doors. That happens. They do it occasionally, but it's the very, very tip of the missionary iceberg. Because you have to understand and appreciate, very few Jews ever converted because someone just gave them a pamphlet on the street. When you meet someone on the street like that, they are annoying. They have no rapport with you. You don't know who they are, and it's a ridiculous little piece of literature, right? There are many reasons why they engage in that activity. Many reasons why they have done that. One of the reasons was because they had a goal, especially Jews for Jesus, to have their name known. They wanted to get branded. Why was that so important for them? And they've worked at it, by the way. It's interesting that they've managed in about 10 or 15 short years to be known by every Jew in North America. They did it partially by being so public and going out and annoying people. But it was important for them because they understood that for Jewish people, let's say a Jewish person gets interested in Jesus. Somehow they have a coworker, they have a neighbor that starts to talk to them, maybe learns the Bible with them. And this Jewish person is now thinking about Jesus, learning about Christianity. But they're going to always say to their Christian friend, you know what, I find this very interesting, but I'm a Jew. And ... And Jews don't believe in Jesus. Right? Meaning that if you assume that there isn't any Jew in the planet that believes in Jesus, it's going to be very difficult for you to sign on. And that's why it was so important for Jews for Jesus to get their name known. Because just the name of their organization was an incredible coup. Because now every Jew in North America knows there's a group called Jews for Jesus, meaning there are Jews who believe in Jesus. Now it's on the menu. Now it's a possibility. Just that accomplishment was very important to them. So they do occasionally go out into the streets and hand out literature, but they themselves learned that it's not the most effective way of communicating. They themselves did many studies and many surveys where they found that very few Jewish people are going to say, I believe, because some stranger gave them a little cute comic strip on the street. They've discovered, however, what is the usual trajectory of Jews into Christianity. They discovered in their own studies it was through the influence of a Christian friend, neighbor, or business associate. It wasn't through some professional missionary wearing a Jews for Jesus t-shirt on the street that the Jew doesn't know and finds annoying. It was from a Christian that works with them, that lives next door to them, that's in their class, that might be a client of theirs. We had their relationships going on. And the Jew is not offended by this person because it's a Christian, it's a non-Jew. It's not offensive that they believe in Jesus. So when groups like Jews for Jesus discovered that the most powerful salesperson is not the professional missionary on the street with a t-shirt, but it's the friends and neighbors and business associates of Jewish people. So if you want to understand how missionary groups function, one of the major things they do is to go to churches every week, every Sunday. They're in churches all over North America. And they're running seminars to do two things. Number one, to encourage Christian lay people to share their faith with their Jewish friends and neighbors. Here they have a standing army of millions of Christians that Jewish people aren't running away from because Jews have a relationship with them. But many of these Christian lay people are maybe reluctant to share their faith. Many Christian people might feel, you know what, I can't talk to my Jewish neighbor. They're Old Testament experts. They're going to blow me away. So the Jews for Jesus people come to the church and say, no, don't be afraid of your Jewish neighbor. You know, most Jewish people never even read the Bible. They're not Old Testament experts. Or many Christian people might feel, you know, it's not really nice. I mean, you know, the Jews just went through the Holocaust. Leave them alone. Don't bother them. I should try to convert them. And the Jews for Jesus person coming into the church says, are you kidding? Do you want them going straight from the fires of Auschwitz to the fires of hell? Do you realize that if you don't tell them about Jesus, that's the most anti-Semitic thing you can do? How could you withhold the good news from them? So the Christian missionaries come to the churches and they encourage these Christians to share their faith with their Jewish friends and neighbors. And then they train them how to do it. What should you say to a Jew? What shouldn't you say? Right? How do you introduce the topic? How do you get into it slowly? How do you develop relationships? And they encourage them. Don't sit down at the first meeting and study the book of Matthew. Maybe begin by asking your Jewish neighbor about their holidays. Ask them, aren't you having a big holiday coming up soon? Your New Year? What's that all about? Don't even talk about your own beliefs. Try to just make connections and begin talking about spiritual issues. Maybe if you know that your Jewish neighbor is going through a crisis, just offer to pray for them. Right? But don't try to convert them. And they train them in different ways how they can begin to slowly build relationships, to slowly get their Jewish friend or neighbor or business associate interested in Jesus. And they give them materials and CDs and books and pamphlets and training materials, and they have websites. And they tell them, you know what? if you're successful, maybe in a year or 2 years or 3 years, your Jewish friend or neighbor may actually become interested in Jesus. But you know what? There's going to be a problem. Because they're always going to say to themselves, yeah, but I'm Jewish. But I'm Jewish. It's the name of a book, I think, they once wrote in Jews for Jesus. But I'm Jewish. And ... The implication is, and Jews don't believe in Jesus. So now the person who went to the church and has a Jewish friend or neighbor, they can say to their Jewish friend or neighbor, you know what, I happen to know a Jewish person who believes in Jesus. Would you like to talk to them? And who is that? That's the Jews for Jesus or other missionary professional that came to their church and ran the training seminar and left their business card. And now what you have to appreciate is that the Jews for Jesus staff people don't spend most of their time running around in the street giving out pamphlets or knocking on doors. What is that called in the sales world? That's called cold calling. When you just go up to strangers that you never met before and try and sell them, that's cold calling. That's the worst kind of sales. It doesn't work like that. What they've done is they have a sales force that they've marshaled, they've trained. They're encouraging Christians that have Jewish friends and neighbors to talk and make inroads with their Jewish friends and neighbors. Now this Jewish friend is going to say, you know, I'm really interested in Jesus and finding out more, but I'm Jewish. Jews don't believe in this. Oh, I know someone that's Jewish that believes in Jesus. Would you like to meet with them? So now the staff person from Jews for Jesus spends most of their time doing what? In sales, it's called closing. They're closers. And they come in after all the groundwork has been done to close the sale. Because I'm a Jew. I believe in Jesus. I go to a Messianic synagogue. I can take you with me to the place where we get together to pray. Right? And that puts the capstone on all of the prior work. That's one thing you have to be aware of. The second thing I think I should mention, just for information purposes, is that today, missionary groups are reporting today that the most fertile field they have for sharing their faith with Jews is guess where? Today, the most fertile ground that they report is the internet, which didn't exist 20 years ago, but today they find to be the most fertile place to reach out to Jews. If you have a Facebook account, there's a good chance that you have friends that are Christians that use their Facebook accounts to share their faith. And if you go to chat rooms, Christians are always prowling in chat rooms, especially Jewish chat rooms, to find Jewish people to talk to. And there are hundreds of Christian missionary websites designed to look Jewish and to seem Jewish. As a matter of fact, when Jewish kids go to a day school or a Hebrew school, do research on any Jewish topic, they might be researching Hanukkah or Purim. Guess what some of the first search results will be on Google? They're going to be from Jewish, Christian, or Messianic Jewish websites that can look very, very, very Jewish. So today, we're finding the internet is simply making the work of missionary groups much, much, much more easy because they have more access to Jewish people. A Jew now doesn't have to step foot in a church. It's very easy for a Jew to click on a website and read something. No one's looking. They're not going to be judged. They can do it very easily in the comfort of their own home. Okay, let's wrap this up. Last thing I'd like to just share with you is a reflection on why are so many Jews vulnerable to this today. And this is a very serious thing to ponder, because the truth of the matter is that the success that missionaries have had is really a litmus test for the health of our community. When you speak to Jews who have converted to Christianity, and I've spoken with hundreds of them, you will usually hear more or less the same story. They'll report to you how they grew up in a Jewish home, they went to Hebrew school, they had a bar bat mitzvah, their family had Passover seders, they lit Hanukkah candles, they may have gone to a Jewish summer camp, but they'll tell you that they only experienced Judaism as a culture, as an ethnicity, as a heritage, as an identity, but it was never experienced by these people who ended up converting, never experienced as a deep spiritual path that led to a personal relationship with God or led to any kind of serious spiritual life. The Judaism was usually superficial, coupled with, again, a usually superficial knowledge of Judaism. A very superficial knowledge, because we as a Jewish community have not made the efforts to ensure that our children and grandchildren are educated on a sophisticated level about Judaism. Half of the Jewish children in North America receive no Jewish education, and the half who receive some Jewish education usually stop at the age of 13. They get bar bat mitzvah, and that's the end. It's very difficult to imagine someone at the age of 13 having enough education to then go out into the world in their 20s and 30s and have any kind of sophisticated appreciation of Judaism. And so what makes us vulnerable are these two, I would say, areas of lack. What the Bible says, and several of our prophets, our people perish due to a lack of knowledge. I would say not just knowledge, but a lack of deep, spiritual, meaningful experiences. And I think that if we wanted to find any silver lining in the missionary problem, it could be that it should be a wake-up call for our community. That it could hopefully get us to really think about, are we as healthy as we could be? Right? And to do it not for their sake, meaning that ultimately we are the ones that suffer, not just the people who end up converting, but when our Judaism is shallow and superficial, we don't get all the benefits out of it. If we relate to it on large as a Jewish community as just once in a while thing that we do, we have it as a hobby, we're sort of dilettantes when it comes to Judaism. Abraham Joshua Heschel said that if Judaism isn't ultimately meaningful, it's not really that meaningful at all. We as Jews are called upon to sacrifice for Judaism in many ways. It's difficult to be a Jew. We are such a small group in a world where the numbers are not with us, they're against us. And it takes a tremendous amount of intestinal fortitude and spiritual fortitude to really not just survive, but to thrive as a Jew. To thrive as a Jew. And so when we think about why Jewish people are vulnerable to groups like Jews for Jesus and other missionary groups, and then go beyond that and think about the bigger issues, like why are so many Jewish people today involved in Eastern religions? Some people estimate 30% of Buddhists in North America coming from a Jewish background. Why is that? Why is it that so many Jewish people report that Judaism did not give them enough spiritually? And ask ourselves, maybe it's our responsibility to change the Jewish world, to make it a Jewish world where people will feel satisfied and feel nourished and feel that there's something in Judaism that they want and they want to stick with. And they won't find the need to go elsewhere. So I believe that, one of the things that we always try to think about in our organization is why we chose the name Jews for Judaism. We didn't name the organization Jews Against Jesus. We're not against Jesus. We chose the name Jews for Judaism because I believe it's the most important thing that all of us can try to do, which is to change our homes, change our institutions, change our communities to be places that radiate incredible passion and spirituality and joy and depth, and to create a Jewish world that will be so inspiring that we won't have to worry about so many Jewish people that are not finding their place within that world.